Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all having a great weekend. Clay will be back with us next week, so this weekend I have a very special guest who is reading this episode for us. This man is a real sweetheart, and I venture to guess that many of you will recognize his voice right away. So a very big thank you to Cam Buckner for stepping in and reading our story this week.
Book 5 of the Wolfman Chronicles, Episode 54. Chapter 3, Caught Between Worlds, Alaska. Jack took the two dogs and walked out into the early morning light. He'd promised Sasha he'd try to pick up the trail that Nadia and Igor had left behind. He knew she was worried that someone from the organization had already come and taken them. But that didn't make sense. The dogs would have alerted the strangers in the house, no matter how quiet and stealth they were. The air was cool and clear, and he listened for the sounds their footsteps would make as they crunched the dead fallen leaves, but the only sounds were songs of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as they flitted about in the branches. The dogs sniffed the air and picked up a scent, and seconds later they were bounding ahead, following one of the many paths that led through the forest. Jack followed swiftly behind them, wondering if he should strip down and assume his wolf body. It would be easier to search that way and easier to keep up with the dogs. He didn't want to be the one to explain his wolf nature to Sasha's daughter, though. That was a topic that Sasha would need to broach with her. The dogs ran ahead and then circled back to make sure Jack was following. They didn't appear to be terribly agitated, which led him to believe that they didn't sense any danger. The walk felt good, and it gave him time to reflect on all that had happened over the past couple of years. He needed to clear his head and come up with a solution to help Sasha's daughter and her boyfriend escape the clutches of the Russian organization that had kidnapped them as children and was molding them into mercenaries. But his mind kept drifting back to the past. Jack Moore was once a simple cattleman, a brand inspector with a quiet life on his Montana ranch. His days were filled with riding the range and tending to cattle and mending fences and dealing with the occasional disagreement when someone's cattle wandered off their range and ended up in another cattleman's herd. It wasn't particularly exciting work, but that was part of the reason it appealed to Jack, and he liked the slow pace of an honest day's work. But on that fateful day, when he found old Buck Humphrey dead, everything changed. Buck's body had been torn apart in a way Jack had never seen, as if a pack of wolves had attacked him, and he wasn't the first. Nathan Smith had met a similar death only days before. Back then, Jack had been investigating several cases of cattle mutilations and disappearances, and at the time, he had suspected it was wolves, and after Buck's death, he and Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris organized a posse of men to search the area up on Hanson's Ridge. What they found would change their lives forever. He had always been a skeptic when it came to anything the slightest bit supernatural. His world was black and white, leaving no room for the mystical or unexplained. But after he witnessed Gunther Yeager's transformation from an enormous wolf-like beast into a regular man's body, after he was killed up on the ridge, he had to shift his entire belief system. Mysterious things did exist in this world, and now he was living proof of it. He hadn't thought about Doc Morris in a long time, and he thought about his trip to Port Angeles and Forks, Washington, where Doc Morris had escaped, to after the initial shock of seeing both Gunther and Hannah Yeager's transformation. And at the time, it had seemed ironic that Doc would choose to retire at the same location that Stephanie Meyer chose for her Twilight book series, a place made famous for its mythical werewolves. If learning that such creatures really did exist in our world, why move to a location where they were supposedly commonplace? He had traveled there to warn Doc Morris that Jaeger's son, Hans, was on a mission of revenge to kill the men responsible for his parents' death. Hans was the reason that Doc Morris and Sheriff Parker were dead, and the reason Jack himself was now able to transform into a wolf whenever he chose to do so. The two dogs were barking up ahead, and as Jack got closer, he could see something tied to a branch of an old-looking tree growing around a large rock. Tied to a branch just at eye level was a man's white handkerchief, so Jack untied it and held it in front of the dogs' noses, and both dogs smelled it and then darted off the path towards a grove of trees. Jack quickly followed, stepping over fallen branches and large rocks that the dogs easily leaped over, and he was nervous about leaving the path, knowing how disorienting the forest could be. The trees grew in dense clusters, blocking out the sun, and it was difficult to get a good feel of which direction you were heading. His thoughts began to drift again, and he thought about his trip to Germany to try to find a cure for the werewolf curse. He remembered the first time when he felt his body shift and transform into the beast. It had been painful, and at first the uncomfortable aching of the back and the way his hips had shifted. It had been a slow and terrifying transformation. Now he could transform back and forth with very little effort, as long as he remembered to remove his clothes first. It was in Germany that he had met Dr. Luther, who had promised him a cure and ended up almost killing Catherine. If I'd never made the trip to Germany, she wouldn't have to endure that torture. But I'd never have met Sasha, and Catherine would not be a mother now, he reminisced. Jack was so deep in thought that he almost tripped when his foot caught a fallen branch hidden under some leaves, and he stumbled and caught himself. How long have I been walking? It feels like hours, and yet the sun hasn't shifted, he thought. Up ahead, the dogs were barking excitedly. There was a pretty spot right next to a creek with a blanket of soft meadow grass growing at the base of the tree, and it looked as though someone had recently slept there. The grass was flattened and disturbed as if a body had lain there just hours before. The dogs were sniffing the grass all around the tree and barking loudly, and suddenly they both bounded down the trail as if they were chasing a rabbit. Jack saw the indention of a boot print in the soft sand near the creek's edge. He had a feeling it was Miguel's. What was he doing all the way out here, Jack wondered. He called his name loudly, but got no response. The dogs will find him, Jack thought, as he walked briskly up the trail following them. Up ahead, the trees were thinning, and Jack could see an opening onto a large meadow. Jack experienced a moment of déjà vu as he remembered the morning he found Sasha laying in a meadow just like this. The sun was warming the dew-covered grass and causing a mist to rise off the ground, and the dogs ran up to a large group of tall boulders and began barking again. "Miguel!" Jack yelled as he entered the clearing. "Jack, up here, quick!" Miguel was standing on the largest of the boulders, large flat rock in the center of the other boulders. Well, Jack ran through the meadow as quickly as he could, dodging holes and jumping over rocks that lay haphazardly strewn about, careful not to twist an ankle or take a fall. The meadow grass was high this time of year, and it was difficult to see all the holes and divots left from small rodents and other wild animals that dug their dens in the tall grass. "Man, I'm glad to see you," Miguel yelled out. "The two Russian kids are up here. They seem to be in a deep sleep or a coma. I can't rouse them. It looks like they've slit their wrists." "What?" Jack asked incredulously. "They slit their wrist? Have they tried removing the tracking devices themselves?" he thought. "But why here, on these rocks in this meadow?" "I didn't want to leave them. I wasn't sure how to get back to your place anyway. I was hoping and praying you'd find us. I don't know how long I've been here waiting," Miguel said as Jack scrambled up the rocks to the high altar stone where the two bodies lay. "How did you find them?" Jack asked Miguel once he'd checked their pulse and made sure the kids were breathing. Well, it's a strange story, and I'll tell you all about it later. But I saw this meadow and thought if I climbed up here on these boulders, I'd be at a high enough vantage point to see your place. Well, I was completely lost. How are we going to get these two down off the rocks? Miguel asked. The dogs were circling the boulders, looking for an easy passage up. Jack stood and looked down on the ground below. Well, we can't safely carry them down. Maybe one of us could stand at the bottom and the other could lower them down, feet first, holding on to their wrists. It might scratch them up a bit, but I think we could do it. Well, they've lost quite a bit of blood. I'm not so sure I want to attempt that, Miguel replied. Well, you can stay here with them. I'll run back to the house and get help. I'll bring Julian and Usko, and the four of us can figure it out. Okay, Miguel replied, and bring some water with you and bandages. Got it. Jack climbed down from the rocks and began stripping his clothes off in order to transform into his wolf body. It would be much faster to run home in his wolf form. Stay, he told the Aussies. The two dogs lay in the tall grass and watched as Jack bounded off toward the forest path that led home. Miguel sat on the rock beside the two still bodies. The sun was rising higher in the sky and it was getting warm. He took off his shirt to put over Nadia and Igor's eyes so they wouldn't have the sun shining right down on their closed eyelids. He wished he had his sunglasses with him. This wasn't the same kind of light he was used to in Mexico. It was clearer, softer, but still bright enough to hurt your eyes, even with your eyes shut. He began to daydream to pass the time, and his thoughts wandered to a woman he had followed into the forest the previous night. It seems he'd spent his entire life chasing one woman or another, and he chuckled as he remembered Jack and himself as young men, both in love with the same girl they'd met at a rodeo. She was a barrel racer and pretty as could be. He couldn't even remember her name now, but he remembered the way Jack looked at her as they both leaned against the wooden fence watching her practice. She was a flirt, and it became obvious that she was playing one cowboy against the other. Jack had taken her to the barn dance and was obviously in love with her, but Miguel had asked her to dance and then let her outside for some fresh air. Jack had found them making out behind the barn, and the night had ended in a fist fight over the girl. That had been the end of their friendship until a little over a year ago when Jack called Miguel to help him get some fugitive gypsy werewolf from Germany across the border into Mexico. The same gypsy werewolf that was now married to his sister Juanita. Did Jack ever explain why Julian was in the United States anyway? He couldn't remember. Miguel laughed. Jack was like a brother to him now, and what a strange time they'd had this past year. Miguel laughed again, and it's getting stronger yet, he thought. He stretched out on the rock and dozed, dreaming of his beautiful Giselle, the love of his life. She had been killed at the PCC, a Brazilian organized crime syndicate, many years ago. No woman had held a candle to her since. And in his dream, she was alive and sitting beside him in this meadow on this rock. He buried his head in her arms and wept like a baby. And when she woke, he realized she'd been crying, or maybe it was just the sun that was making his eyes tear up. So he wiped his eyes and saw a movement through the trees at the far edge of the forest. Squinting, he tried to make out if it was Jack returning with the men. Then he saw the long white gown as the woman from the night before stepped out from the trees and began walking toward him. He watched her, wondering if he was dreaming again. She didn't really walk to him, but appeared to be gliding over the grass. I must be dreaming, he thought, as the woman slowly approached. He closed his eyes and rubbed them again, hoping to wake himself from this dream. But when he reopened his eyes, he gasped. The woman was beside him now on the rock, and he nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw her. She was kneeling over the two prone bodies who were still, soundly sleeping and checking their wrist. She pulled a poultice out of her bag and began applying it to the wounds. "Who are you?" Miguel whispered. She turned to look at him. She had beautiful, light blue eyes, the lightest blue he had ever seen. In the sunlight, they appeared to have tiny diamonds sparkling in them. She smiled, and he thought she was one of the most beautiful women he'd ever seen. She turned her head back to the two young Russians and continued applying the poultice. From the bottom of her gown, she tore a piece of cloth and wrapped it around the injured wrists. Then she removed Miguel's shirt from their faces and handed it to Miguel. Without saying a word, she leaned over and kissed them both on their forehead, and their eyes slowly fluttered open, and they both took a large, deep breath and tried to sit up. As Miguel reached an arm out to help Nadia sit, the mysterious woman stood and was simply gone, vanished right into thin air. No one's going to believe this, Miguel thought, as he helped Nadia and Igor sit up. "Where are we?" Nadia gasped as she glanced around at the surrounding meadow. "How did we get here?" "Well, your guess is as good as mine," Miguel replied. "There's some strange things happening here in these woods. I don't know what I'm doing out here either, but Jack is on his way with Julian and Usko. They'll help you get down, and we'll get back to the house," Miguel replied. Nadia touched the bandage on her wrist. "Well, what happened to us?" "You didn't do that?" Miguel asked. "No," she exclaimed. "It looks like your tracking devices were removed," Igor said, looking up at Miguel with a surprised look on his face. "It wasn't me," Miguel replied. "I was trying to find my way back to Jack's when I stumbled onto this meadow. I thought I'd climb up on these rocks to see if I could see his place from up here, and that's when I found you two." "We were trying to leave," Nadia explained, "early this morning before anyone in the house was up. We need to check with Vitya, and if we don't, he'll have a crew here looking for us, most likely by this afternoon." Miguel nodded. "Well, someone thought it was a good idea to remove those tracking devices. I'm not sure why, because the Russian organization that you work for already knows you're here, unless you two plan on running. They're going to find you one way or another, tracking devices or not." Miguel paused and thought for a minute. "You know, now that the tracking devices have been removed, there isn't any reason for them to find you in Mexico. I mean, so far as they haven't connected me with you, right? You could hide out at my place in Mexico and they would never find you." Through the trees, they could hear voices coming. The two dogs had been patiently waiting where Jack told them to stay, but now they bounded through the meadow, anxious to meet up with Jack and the two others. Miguel hollered, "Jack, they're awake! Help me get them down!" Jack, Usko, and Julian rushed over and helped ease Nadia and Igor down the rocks. Miguel followed after. They were weak, but there was no bleeding under the wrapping around their wrists. Jack and Miguel stood on either side of Nadia with their arm linked to hers and helped her walk. Usko and Julian did the same with Igor while the dogs bounded ahead. "I'd love to know what's going on around here," Miguel said. "It was a pretty crazy night for all of us. Let's get these two to the house, and then I want to hear everyone's story," Jack replied. The long dining table was barely large enough to accommodate everyone, but extra chairs were pulled up and everyone silently ate Rosa's hearty breakfast. Rosa had insisted everyone get some food in them before any excuses or explanations were discussed. After everyone had eaten their fill, Jack stood and raised his mimosa in a toast. "Looks like most of us had a pretty crazy night last night. We're all anxious to hear the stories, but first I want to make a toast. It's really wonderful having all of us here together. Grizzly, thank you for giving us this opportunity to have a place where everyone can come, and thank you, Rosa, for this incredible breakfast that she managed to throw together considering there were no groceries in the house." He raised his glass to her and then looked at everyone around the table. "And this is a toast to family and to new beginnings." Everyone clinked their glasses together. Jack continued to stand. "We have a lot to talk about, and we all want to know exactly what happened last night. And for Nadia and Igor's benefit, I think we need to let them know who we really are. I mean, they know us by name, but if we're going to fight these Russian crooks as a family, they need to know who we really are." He sat down and Catherine spoke up. "I don't know if we can trust them. I'm sorry to say that, Sasha, but how can we be sure they won't turn us all in to this organization or whatever it's called?" Nadia replied, "I understand your concern and the danger you are in because of us. Igor and I did not choose to be a part of the organization. We were stolen from our families when we were kids and brought up with stories that our parents abandoned us, that they didn't want us. Igor learned only recently that they killed the rest of his family. He was away at boarding school when it happened. The organization raised him just as they did me. We both have talked many times about escaping, but we didn't know how to get away." Catherine glared at her. "Well, that's your problem, not ours. We have the children to think of now. And my memory of what they did to me in Russia is still too fresh. They would have killed me if Usko hadn't rescued me. I don't want any part of this." "Cat," Jack replied firmly, "we are all family, and Nadia and Igor are part of this family now. We have to protect each other. Now, I understand your concern, and we'll do everything we can to protect the twins, to protect all of us." Miguel spoke up. "I think it might be wise for Kat and Usko to take the little ones back to Mexico. I also think it's wise for Nadia and Igor to hide out there. The Russians don't know about me or my place. They'll be safe there. Let's get them out of here right away." Jack considered Miguel's suggestion. "I think I agree with you, Miguel. Nadia and Igor would be safer out of the country. But before we start discussing how all this is going to work, I want to know exactly what happened last night. Who wants to go first?" He looked directly at Nadia and Igor, urging one of them to begin explaining the strange events that befell them in the forest. Nadia began. "I was in a panic to get out of here. I knew we needed to report back to headquarters. Vitya was expecting to hear from us yesterday, and if he does not receive our communication, he will be quick to send others out here. I thought I would be protecting you if we could just somehow reach him. Our cell phones don't work out here, but we have specialized equipment back at the safe house in Fairbanks, and our car is hidden in the trees about a mile from Grizzly's cabin. So my plan was to get to our car and drive till we had some phone reception. We were preparing to drive all the way back to Fairbanks if needed. I meant to leave you a note, but in the haste of leaving I neglected to do so. Igor and I followed the trail that parallels the road, but somehow we kept going in circles, even though the direction finder on my phone told us we were continually walking east. Igor noticed we kept passing the same tree. He tied a handkerchief to a branch to be sure." Jack nodded and pulled the handkerchief he had found earlier this morning out of his pocket and handed it to Igor. "It was then that we started hearing children's laughter and seeing strange kids running through the trees, like they were playing hide and seek. We started walking toward them, and I asked one if they had seen our car. Well, it was awful. The thing opened its mouth and a horrible scream came from it, and then they all joined in. It was ear-splitting, and that's the last thing I remember until we woke up on that rock and Miguel was there." Igor nodded. "I have nothing more to add. We woke up and had these bandages tied around our wrists." He held his up for everyone to see and slowly unwrapped it. Our tracking devices had been removed, and if that wasn't strange enough, the wound was already starting to heal. Jack looked at Miguel. "What about you?" he asked. Miguel looked around the table. "I was asleep when I heard singing outside. I looked out the window and there was a woman out there in a long white nightgown. Well, she waved at me to come to her, and I did. I followed her. I don't know what happened after that, but I woke up naked. My clothes were tied up in a tree. I had to get my boots down." He stopped and laughed. "It was the damnedest thing. I really don't know what happened. I thought maybe I had too much whiskey, but anyway, I started walking up the path trying to find my way back here. And I stumbled upon that meadow and found these two laying up on the tallest rock, that big flat one. And at first I thought they had found a heck of a place to sleep, but then I realized they were in some kind of a coma or a trance. I just sat there trying to wake them up, wondering what to do, but then Jack came along and he found us. Jack told me to wait with them while he went to get help, and while he was gone, he paused and looked down. You're not going to believe this, but that woman in the long white nightgown showed up again. She was just walking out from the trees, and the next thing I knew, she was on the rock. I never even saw her climb up. She was just there, right next to me. She put some kind of poultice on their wrists and then tore some material from her gown and tied their wrists up with it. And then she kissed them on the forehead, I think, and they woke up. Well, he laughed again. Well, it sounds so crazy when I tell it, but that's what really happened. Grizzly laughed. Well, Miguel, you met the Maker. The what? Miguel asked. Sasha explained. The Maker is a beautiful woman who lures men into the woods and seduces them. It's from Ukrainian folklore, so we know about them in Russia. They have long hair and they're very beautiful, and they're known as the soul of the forest. They have no reflection in water, nor do they cast shadows. They live in the forest, mountain caves, and sometimes in sheds. They make their clothing from wild flax, which they weave into thin transparent cloth like the long white nightgown you saw. They love flowers and like to weave them in their hair. She nodded thoughtfully. They plant flowers in the mountains and the forest. She looked at Jack. Now it all makes sense. The flowers that looked like they'd been recently planted and the flowers that were braided into my hair and laid all around me the day you found me in that meadow. Maybe the children thought I was a Maker too. Jack turned to Grizzly. You've heard of these Maker creatures? Oh yeah, I've seen them. When I was a young man living here in these woods, they'd come out at night and sing to me. Until my sweet Jessie ran them all off. She was the jealous type, you know. So do you think she's the one that removed our tracking devices? Nadia asked him. The Maker? Could be. A lot of strange things happen here in these woods, Grizzly replied. I've seen some mighty strange things in my years here in Alaska. I already told you about my Sasquatch that showed up every now and then, and I also told you about those wolves and, well, hell, now we have a whole pack of werewolves living up here. Jack shot him a quick glance. Before we get into that topic, what else happened last night that we need to know about? I saw Sasha out in the meadow last night, Catherine said, staring at Sasha accusingly. Sasha took a deep sigh. A couple of weeks ago, before we left for Mexico, I buried the jewel outside. And last night, I went out there to dig it up so I could give it to Nadia and hand it over to the organization. I thought it would be safe out there, but she took another breath. It was gone. It's gone? Nadia gasped. Well, if you buried it out there by the rock at the edge of the meadow, the one that has the big indention in it, then the Maker probably has it, Grizzly explained. That's an offering rock. My sweet Jessie used to leave little gifts there for the Maker and all her little children. Well, how do we get it back? Sasha asked. Well, you could try offering something in exchange. Miguel, perhaps, Grizzly laughed. Seems she's taken a liking to him. Rosa brought another pot of coffee. Grizzly smiled up at her as she refilled his cup. He patted the empty chair beside him. Sit a spell, Rosie. What do you think of all this nonsense? Rosa sat down next to Grizzly. I think you all coming here has upset the natural balance of this place. The spirits that inhabit this forest are just curious. Sasha spoke. This is all my fault. It was my husband, Peter, who stole the Orlov diamond from the Kremlin, and, well, it's a long story, but now he's dead, and I have the jewel, or I did have it anyway. I always intended on getting it back to the Russian government somehow, but at that time I just wanted to flee, and I went to the only safe place that I could think of, Jack's ranch in Montana. Of course, he didn't know I was there at the time. Sasha looked down at her lap and quietly said, I was disguised, But then he found me and we left the ranch and came out here to Alaska. I always knew that they'd find me eventually, but I really thought I could use the jewel as leverage to get my daughter back. And now she's here, and I've lost the jewel, and they'll kill us all if we don't give them back that jewel." Catherine looked at her angrily. "They kidnapped me less than a year ago and held me captive in a medical lab outside Moscow. They drained nearly all of the blood out of my body. I would have died if Usko hadn't rescued me. You need to understand, I will do anything in my power to protect my children from those men." "I don't know who's going to approach this subject, so I will," Catherine continued. "We have a special gene in our blood that allows us to transform into wolves. Jack, Julian, myself, Usko, and even my children." Nadia and Igor both looked at her like she was crazy. "I know it sounds unbelievable," Jack said, "but it's actually the truth. There are people who can transform their bodies into various animals. I know it sounds like a far-fetched fairy tale, and every one of us here at the table wouldn't have believed it either if we didn't see it in person." "You're serious, aren't you?" Igor asked. "Dead serious," Miguel commented. "They're all wolves, but Juanita and I, we come from Mexico. She's my sister, if you haven't figured that out already. And in Mexico, we don't call them werewolves. We use the word naigual, but basically it's the same thing." Nadia stared at each of them and then turned to her mother. "You too, Mom?" "I was attacked in Russia by a woman who had turned into a wolf," Sasha replied. "And it took a while for the transformation to occur in me, but it's true." "But it's not what you think," Jack quickly reassured her. "It's not like what you've seen in the movies, at least not for us. We can transform ourselves at will, but we mostly take on the form of a wolf. Not the scary half-human, half-wolf that Hollywood makes us out to be. However, if we are angry enough, that side of us does come out as well. We've all seen that happen." "This is impossible to believe." Nadia shook her head and looked at Igor. "I don't know what to say." "We didn't believe it either in the beginning," Jack muttered. Grizzly had been sitting back in his chair, hands folded over his chest. "My wife was a full-blooded native Alaskan Indian, and when she told me about the Wolfins, that's what she called them, I told her she was plumb out of her mind. Those natives believed in lots of superstitious nonsense, I thought, but that was in the beginning of our marriage. And over the years, I learned to believe everything she told me, because I seen it for myself. There are all kinds of mysterious things in the woods. Anyone living out here in the Alaskan wilderness will tell you that. Most folks never take a step outside their own little world, especially those who live in the damn cities. Well, I say get your head out of your ass. There's more to the world than what you'll see in your concrete jungle. Now, you kids have nothing to be scared about. These are good folks here, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect you and those two little ones upstairs." Jack nodded and poured himself another cup of coffee. "Okay, here's the plan, unless any of you can come up with something better. We get Kat, Usko, and the kids on a plane to Mexico as quickly as possible, today if we can. Nadia and Igor, you're going to have to hide out here while we get some new IDs for you. And Miguel, you're going to do whatever it takes to meet up with that Maka and try to convince her to give back the jewel. And Grizz and Julian and I are going to work on getting the place booby-trapped all the way down to the river. And Sasha, I want you and Juanita to drive Kat and Usko to the airport in Fairbanks and pick up all the supplies we're going to need. And Rosa, you should probably go back to Mexico too. It would be safer for you there." "I'm staying right here," Rosa replied. "Someone's got to make sure you eat, and Catherine is perfectly capable of taking over the kitchen back home." Juanita laughed. "Well, that's a first. In all our years, Rosa has never allowed anyone, not even our mother, to help out in her kitchen. That was her territory and off-limits to everyone. You should feel very honored, Catherine." "I'll be glad to leave," Catherine replied. There's something about this place that really puts me on edge. She got up from the table and started walking toward the bedroom where Usko was tending to the twins. That's an understatement, Sasha whispered to Juanita. As everyone else began to disperse, Jack turned to Nadia and Igor. Get some rest. You'll need your strength for what's coming next. It's going to take a day or two to get your new passports. We need to be prepared if we're attacked before we can get you to safety. As Nadia returned to the room that she and Igor shared downstairs, a heavy dread settled across her chest. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, betraying the organization and turning her back on everything they had molded her to be. She knew the organization wouldn't rest until they found her. But it wasn't just her life at stake. Igor and all the others. She knew when the organization came for her, they would come for all of them. She took a deep breath, steadying her racing heart. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that fear could either break you or make you stronger. And she had no intention of breaking.
Thank you all for listening in to this week's episode. What a special treat to have Cam reading our episode this week. For those of you who are not familiar with Cam Buckner, which I'm sure most of you are, Cam has a great YouTube channel called Dixie Cryptid. And Cam was the one who actually helped me get started with this channel, taught me everything I know. So thank you again, Cam. You are such a sweetheart. I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you all next weekend here on The Hidden Corners.